Good morning, students. This is Dr. Faith Acker, and this morning I'm going to be talking you through an annotated bibliography entry. Today I'm going to write it on the article that we read earlier this semester called The Case for the Health Taxes by David Leonard, and we're going to look at the 4 elements that you'll want to include in your final bibliography. So the first thing that we need is an actual bibliographic entry. And I've already gone ahead and written that because we've been working on these in class for quite some time, and I think you'll be able to do that with ease. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to write a short summary of the article for 2 to 5 sentences and include our in-text citations. And the reason we include our in-text citations is because when you get to the end of this annotated bibliography, you want to be able to pull chunks out of this entry and use them in your final paper. So if you do this correctly along the way, it will save you a lot of time. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to briefly explain why the article is credible. And finally, at the very end, we're going to talk a little bit about how I plan to use this article in a hypothetical essay along the way. So we'll start with my citation. I do just want to point out while I have your attention here on this video that I've gone ahead and put this in a hanging indent in MLA format. I've used the correct formatting for a title of an article and the title of its container, which in this case is a newspaper, and I've used a hanging indent. And just in case you've forgotten, we're going to look at the paragraph menu. Your spacing is going to be 0 before and after. That's very important. Your line spacing is going to be double. And you're going to use a hanging indent, which means that the last name of the author over here, where Leonard is sticking out over the second line of my citation. Now, I've chosen this article from the New York Times, which doesn't have additional containers, so your citations are probably going to look longer than mine because most of you are picking them from databases, but that's okay. This is just for the annotated bibliography in general. Once your paragraph menu looks like this, you're good to go. And if you've already written your bibliography, you can just go in and type this right on your current bibliography because you should have, as of this morning, 3 sources for your research paper. So, in order to actually write a good annotated bibliography entry, I need something called a working thesis. And my working thesis doesn't have to be my eventual article, but it does need to point out the major ideas that I'm planning to cover in my eventual paper. So my working thesis, I've put it over here for you on the left, is the rise of obesity in America could be slowed in many differing ways, but one of the most commonly proposed solutions involves the levying of a controversial vice tax on sugary products. And I want to point out the word controversial here because I'm going to be using that in my eventual paper to show both sides of the perspective. And I'm also going to point out that there are many differing ways. I would probably make these statements more specific as I got more into my paper and figured out whether I could write it just on the soda tax or whether I needed to look at maybe even a combination of solutions. But I've just written this very quickly for an annotated bibliography. So I want you to think about where you expect your paper to be going before you start to write your annotated bibliography. Are you of the opinion by this point that a particular approach is the best? Start by critically evaluating that particular approach in your thesis statement. And notice that I haven't put a solution in my working thesis. This paper is going to be a little bit more of a surprise along the way, so I'm really evaluating the pros and cons of the health tax or the sugar tax rather than trying to bludgeon somebody over the head with here are a bunch of reasons that the health tax is a good idea. David Leonard, whose article you read, does more of the opposite. He kind of bludgeons us with a lot of reasons that the soda tax is a good choice. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to describe what he says. So the first thing you'll want to do in your annotated bibliography is you're going to write a summary. And your summary should be targeted towards what you're going to say in your eventual article. And so because I'm looking at why this is a controversial move, I've ignored some things that I think are actually very interesting in Leonard's argument. He has this wonderful paragraph about the history of sugar taxes. If I were talking about other countries and their precedents, I might talk about that, but that ends up not being something that I think is going to be important to evaluating the pros and cons. Instead, what I've realized is that the strongest part of this article is his description, mostly on page 2, of different things that different legislators have said about the soda tax. How does the government think and feel about the soda tax? So particularly, I think it's a good strength here that he refers to some mayors and the Treasury secretaries and people who think about the financial impacts, that's the Treasury secretary, that this tax would have on the government, and also the health benefits that it would have. So they're looking at this from a very economic and governmental standpoint, and I need to acknowledge that here because I'll also want to get some other perspectives, some medical perspectives and other things. So I've summarized this, and what I'm going to do is put my summary directly after my bibliographic entry. And I've already written my summary, but I would normally just put my cursor right here at the end of my bibliographic entry and start writing. I want all of this to be in one huge, long, wonderful paragraph. It's going to run together quite a bit. So I've talked about the main premise of his article. That's my first sentence, is a little overview, and this is actually going to feel very much like your summary response paper. Then I've noted that he thinks everything is successful. Tobacco taxes have been successful, and soda taxes would be as well. And then I've talked about the different things that the government thinks about, that Leonard has said the government thinks about in its production of the soda tax overall. So I've got about a 3-sentence summary. My third sentence is a little long. You're going to want to have between 2 and 5 sentences, and the first one should be a little bit more general and a little bit more of an overview. This one tells, actually it doesn't overview as much as I would like it to, but it does say, like, his main premise is that soda taxes should be implemented in America. And then I talk about some key points that he makes that are relevant to me. So I can ignore parts of the argument that aren't relevant to me, and that's very important. I've also started every sentence with Leonard, so I don't have any parenthetical citations. I don't have any page numbers in this article. If you were citing this and this was covered on a page in a PDF, you could put the parenthetical citation right here at the end. I don't have page numbers, but I do really encourage you to put your citations in, or your attributions in, to use your author's name in every sentence. And again, that's because when you get to your paper, you're going to be hopefully pulling sections out of this and using them and integrating them into your final paper. And if you go ahead and do the tedious work of citing now, you don't have to go back and find authors or forget who wrote a sentence once you've copied and pasted it. So that's just my general tip. Now, the next thing I want to do is look at this, whether this article is credible. And this article is credible in a kind of a weird way. And what I mean by that is that this isn't a peer-reviewed article. We've already talked about how news articles aren't peer-reviewed. So I need to acknowledge that in my description of its credibility. I've started by saying this article isn't peer-reviewed, but Leonard has interviewed several government officials. They aren't peer-reviewed either, obviously. But they are voted for. Their statements show a specific legislative perspective on the taxes which would be hard to replicate in peer-reviewed journals. That's why I'm not using a peer-reviewed source. So several of you for your papers are using governmental sources, so you'll acknowledge that these aren't peer-reviewed, but they are published by somebody in a position of authority, namely the government. You might be looking at the results of a task force, or at congressional minutes, or a governmental website. So it's okay to use a source or two that aren't peer-reviewed, but you need to indicate why the lack of a peer review is okay. If you're looking at an article that is peer-reviewed, that's fine. You want to state that it's peer-reviewed, or that it was published in a reputable publication, or something like that. Since it's not peer-reviewed, I'm going to kind of ignore most of Leonard's first page, which is why I haven't really summarized all of the locations that he lists, and I'm going to focus mostly on the second page, and I've included that here. I'm going to focus on the ideas Leonard quotes and paraphrases from these other sources. Finally, the very end of my, and this I'm going to blur all together. This is going to look like a crazy long inverted paragraph with the first line sticking out. Finally, at the very end of this page, I'm going to talk about how I'm going to use this article, and I've already started doing that in my justification of this as a non-peer-reviewed article, but you probably, if you're using a peer-reviewed article, you won't need to do that. So I'm going to say this article is going to show me the sugar tax debate from the government's perspective. That's implying that I'm going to have a lot of other perspectives as well. The article's claims about the health issues are supported by the scholarly article by Lustig, Schmidt, and Brindis. So I'm correlating this to another article that I'm probably also going to include in my eventual annotated bibliography. And then I would like to find an article or study that supports Leonard's claim that vice taxes reduce consumption. So Leonard says somewhere over here that if we tax this, it will eventually lower consumption because people won't be able to afford these sugary things. Tweaking this. Sorry. So over here, Leonard says that vice taxes or taxes on sugar, he calls them health taxes, but I'm going to call them vice taxes because that's their more common name. He says that having those taxes will reduce consumption. I want to go find a scholarly article or a scholarly study that will support that rather than quoting his article. And that's it. That's all I have to do for my annotated bibliography. Here it is in full. Well, the other thing, I've just done this off of a works cited page. So we're going to retitle Annotated Bibliography. So that's all you need. You want an annotated bibliography entry. That's this bit right up here. You know what? I'll actually color code this for you. That'll be more fun. So here's my annotated bibliography, or my bibliographic entry. Then I want a short summary. You do not have to color code these. I'm just doing this so you can see this better, since I can't point them out to you quite as easily as I normally would. I want a brief explanation of credibility. So this is why I've said it's not peer-reviewed, but these are things that I can do that will make it seem more credible. And then I have a short description of how I'm planning to use it in my eventual essay overall. Whoops. So you'll want your annotated bibliographies to have these same components. In particular, try to write a sentence or two for each. You're going to be uploading this to me on Blackboard, and you'll also be telling me some things about some of your other articles that we would have done today in class. So you can rewatch this multiple times if you want. You can screenshot or freeze it, and I will put my color-coded annotated bibliography up on Blackboard so that you can see it if you want to use it as a template. Please email me if you have any questions, and have a wonderful day.